On the 11th day of the 11th month, at 11 o'clock, we stop and remember the service and the sacrifice, the lives and the deaths of those who fought for Australia in the First World War, the Second World War, and all the wars since then right up to the present day. The words appear before us, lest we forget. But what exactly is it that we're supposed to remember?
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
It's great to have you here for another week of Signs Radio. And on the phone with me from Avondale University College is Professor Daniel Reyno from the School of Humanities and Creative Arts. How are you, Daniel?
I'm very well.
Excellent. And look, I should have also said you're a singer-songwriter. I've heard some of your original songs and quite enjoyed them.
Oh, thank you.
But so history has been, I mean, you have a finger in a lot of pies, let's face it, but history has been a passion of yours for a while. You've written a number of books focusing on the First World War in particular, looking at the surviving cinema footage we have of the First World War, and also looking at some of the chaplains in the First World War, a little bit of an untold story there. What is it that keeps bringing you back to the First World War?
I guess I've always been fascinated by war. It is an intrinsically fascinating subject. It's humanity at its destructive worst and, often noble best. More recently, I've tried to marry my interest in religion and my interest in war by studying the nature of not just the chaplains, but I've actually published on the religious views and experiences of the Anzacs themselves.
That's right. Yeah, the guys in the trenches. That's right. Yeah, that was your most recent book, wasn't it?
Yep. Yeah. Anzac spirituality.
Wow. So it looks that's fascinating. I mean, look, here we are on the 11th of the 11th, 2019. So this is 101 years, to the day since the end of the First World War. So, and at 11 o'clock, often, we take 2 minutes of silence and all that sort of thing. But this was 101 years ago. So Daniel, can you just refresh our memories? What actually happened on the 11th of November, 1918?
Well, the shooting war came to an end on the Western Front.
Right.
That is to say, the Germans signed an armistice, not a peace treaty. That happened the following year at Versailles, to stop the actual shooting war.
It was a ceasefire, basically.
Implemented at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November.
Right. So this is what we call a ceasefire now? Or is it more, or is an armistice more than that?
Ceasefire is probably a step down from an armistice. An armistice is where you have a more formal agreement, a more long-term agreement to stop shooting while you negotiate a peace treaty. A ceasefire might be so that you can pick up the dead in no man's land or something like that.
Okay, but it actually took a whole year until the sort of the agreements and the treaty and everything was concluded to officially end the First World War. A whole year. Why did it take them that long? What did they have to work out?
Well, there were many parties to the negotiations. There were many allied countries who wanted to have their say, including Australia. Prime Minister Hughes went there and fought vigorously for his agenda being part of the Versailles Peace Treaty.
Oh, right. Okay. I mean, I remember high school history hearing that there was a lot of animosity against the Germans in particular. I mean, they weren't the only people on, in the only country in the Axis side, but there was a desire to really make Germany pay, and there were some pretty stiff reparations that were organised during that process that Germany pretty much had no choice but to accept. And it's even been suggested that they were one of the factors leading to the Second World War later on. Is that a simplistic high school sort of version of history, or is there some truth to that?
Look, it's not bad. Of course, in the First World War, the Germans were part of what we call the Central Powers. The Axis didn't exist until World War II.
Oh, okay, my mistake.
But no, there's certainly the vengeful terms of the Versailles Treaty, led in particular by the French Premier, who wanted to get the Germans back. This was the second time the Germans had invaded in 40 years. And so it took till late June 1919 to sign that treaty.
Wow, okay. And how... Can you explain the origins to us of Armistice Day or Remembrance Day? That when did it actually sort of kick off, and what was the motivation behind marking this date of the 11th of November every year?
Well, it took off fairly early because of the sheer scope of the Great War, the First World War. It was actually celebrated, if that's the right word, or remembered the year after the war ended. So it began in November 1919,
right? Okay.
With a meeting of the British King and the French President. And many countries around the world have picked up on it and remember their war dead with Remembrance Day.
And I guess at that point they called it the Great War, didn't they? They called it the war to end all wars. It seems like the impact of that First World War, the fact that it was such an international conflict, the new technology that was involved there, really left an incredible scar and an incredible psychological trauma on so many populations of so many nations. It
did. In fact, it marks a change in our attitude to war. This is the first time on any kind of scale that we've actually tried to bury the dead in individual marked graves.
Right.
And the scale of death was on such a horrendous, number of people that we created vast war cemeteries that became sites of remembrance and sites of mourning. In previous wars, you picked up the bodies, dug a big pit, threw them all in, and walked away. But the First World War was different scale. Media made it possible for us to know, sometimes in close to real time, what was happening. And so, lasting 4 or 5 years, affecting the entire world, it really did have an enormous impact on the international psyche.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know if you're driving through, the country in Australia, you'll come to a little town, that's, a 2-horse town, as they say, but you'll go to the middle of that town, there'll be a cenotaph there, and there'll be a list of names of, lives lost in the Great War. And it's often surprising, if not shocking, for a town that size, how many, men and boys, let's face it, actually lost their lives from that town in that Great War. It's repeated over and over all around Australia, and I guess in plenty of other countries too.
Yes, that's exactly right. The scale of it was enormous, and its impact in towns large and small across Australia, as you say, can be seen in the cenotaphs, in the boards, in churches and workplaces, and it scarred a generation.
Yeah, RSLs, yeah, all sorts of places. What's interesting, I find, is that in so many of these places, these World War I monuments in particular, the words "lest we forget." What are we supposed to not be forgetting? And I guess the fact that I need to ask the question suggests that we may have.
Yeah, well, when Australia was involved in the war, there was an overwhelming sense of purpose. The angst about the war wasn't about why we fought, but more how we fought. The sense of large-scale casualties and the front line not moving. One of the ironies of war is that you can lose huge numbers of men in a retreat, and that's okay, and you can lose huge numbers in an advance, and that's okay. But when you lose huge numbers and go nowhere, that's when it's really problematic. And of course, that happened for 3 years on the Western Front. So,
and then it gets Gallipoli similar, like years and years, and basically never got anywhere. Same sort of story.
Well, it was 8 months at Gallipoli.
Oh, okay, 8 months. Sorry, yes.
Yeah,
but still a long time with no ground and a heck of a body count.
Yes, Yeah,
Same
but
sort of
that's
story.
completely dwarfed by what happens on the Western Front,
Right.
except in the Australian imagination.
Yeah, right, okay.
But coming back to purpose, Australians were very clear as to why they fought. They fought for a series of values and outlooks, some of which we still have and some of which we hopefully are leaving or have left behind.
Mm-hmm.
So, lest we forget, is about these men who sacrificed, and they were men predominantly. There were very, very few underaged soldiers in the Australian forces.
Mm-hmm.
They fought for their concept of liberty, which was a very British concept of liberty. They fought against what they perceived as German values of tyranny and militarism.
Mm-hmm.
They fought for the right for Australia to remain white. That was very much at the forefront of their thinking. So, lest we forget, is a statement of these men lost their lives. Let's make sure that the reason they lost their lives isn't obscured and forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think it has been?
It depends what you mean by that. Now societies always change and their values always, shift. And some of the things the Anzacs fought for, we would be very unhappy with today in Australia.
I mean, empire, for example, was a big deal, wasn't it?
Empire and race. Over and over and over again, you find proudly, overtly racist statements in the rhetoric of Anzac, the soldiers' diaries and letters, the statements of politicians. One of the things that would shock Anzacs today, if they could, pop out of their graves and look at an Anzac Day march in Western Sydney, is that the school bands playing in their honour are, predominantly non-white. They actually fought to prevent that happening.
Wow. Okay.
But we've moved on, and we can't blame them for standing up for their values, nor should we resile from the fact that they actually fought for that. But we've moved on. We can say we've moved on from that. On the other hand, they were opposed to a particular view of militarism. They wanted to uphold a British concept of values, which in its day was probably one of the most liberal in the world. So in context, they largely fought for good things, and we can honour them because of the integrity with which they went to war.
Mm-hmm. Something that fascinates me about the First World War in particular, Daniel, and I'd be interested, in the context of what you said, I'd be interested in your view on this. Often the phrase is bandied around at, Anzac Day events that those diggers, those First World War soldiers, died for our freedom. But from my way of thinking, Australia's freedom wasn't particularly threatened in the First World War. So is this just, a convenient sort of post-event revisionism, or is there actually some truth to that these guys in the First World War actually fought and died for our freedom?
Well, I guess that hinges on our understanding of Australian.
Yeah.
The Australians of the time saw themselves as British.
Yeah.
There was no Australian passport, not until 1948.
Wow.
Every Australian citizen was a citizen of Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And when Australians fought for freedom, they fought for the freedom for a British way of life, as opposed to their perception of a German militaristic way of life.
Right, okay.
So it's that kind of freedom they're pushing for. And also the additional one, the freedom for Australia to stay as a white man's country. And that was the clause that Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, fought tooth and nail for at Versailles, to make sure that Australia didn't have to let non-whites into the country. So, yeah, there were some specifically Australian freedoms, but more generically they saw themselves as upholding British values.
Okay. So, look, in this month's Signs of the Times magazine, Daniel Kuberek has written an article called How to Remember Them, looking at some of these issues and making some practical suggestions. But he gives some interesting history along the way. He says that it's not really history, it's not that long ago, in 1997, the Governor-General at that time, Sir William Deane, declared that Armistice Day would be renamed Remembrance Day. So it wouldn't just be about the First World War anymore. It would be about, I guess, all the conflicts, past and up to the present, in which Australian forces were fighting. Was that a wise decision to make, do you think? Or do you understand the rationale behind it?
Yes, I think it's a very wise decision. Australia has an obsession with Anzac that clouds its view of nearly everything else.
Mm-hmm.
A recent book highlighted that by pointing out that we actually spent more on memorialising Anzac over the last, 5 years of Great War remembrance than we've spent on our current living veterans.
Whoa.
In fact, we've spent more per capita, significantly more per capita than any other country in the world on Great War remembrance, but we are not doing well in looking after our current vets.
Boy. And these are guys who are often struggling with things like PTSD and...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's warping our view of history. And again, we've got an obsession with Gallipoli, which was a minor campaign of 8 months, compared with the huge campaign on the Western Front and the pretty large campaign in Palestine. So in a way, the Anzac legacy, it's true what it's about, but it distorts because we make it the only thing. And I think Sir William Deane was right to ask us to lift our vision to a broader sense of commemoration.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting because for me, I guess I come from I won't say I'm a pacifist, but I probably have sympathies with the pacifist point of view, and seeing just the waste of life in the First World War, the way that it escalated from, one ally brought another ally on board, and then the other side brought another ally on board, and the whole thing escalated to become a world war when it doesn't really seem it needed to. And then we have these campaigns, like you say, that went on for months or years, where hundreds of thousands of people died, and the pointlessness of that war, for me, seems to ring in those words, lest we forget. But when there seems to be, to me, some really clear lessons that we should have learnt from the First World War. But then when we sort of bring in the Second World War, the Vietnam War, some other wars, it sort of seems to muddy the waters a little bit in terms of, hey, war is an awful, pointless thing. Am I trying to make something complex, too simple here, or do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes, I do. And I don't think lessons from war are necessarily simple. Wars happen for complex reasons. They are fought in complex ways, and the conclusions can be complex as well. I'm not sure that the First World War was a pointless war.
Okay.
It happened at a point in time where few expected it. Everyone was expecting a European war, but not quite then.
Right.
Which is how it escalated, because nobody had their guard up. But essentially it was a clash between national egos, and that's never acceptable. But the fact is, it happens, and would you argue against someone who fought against Nazism or Japanese militarism in World War II? Would you say that they were fighting a good cause?
Well, that's right, exactly. That seems much more clear cut. Hitler invades, well, you've got to stop him. The Japanese invade, well, you've got to stop them. But whereas the First World War seems a lot more muddy, I guess, a lot more difficult to sort of get your head around. Who made the first move? Who were the bad guys? Who was trying to achieve what? It all seems to be pretty confusing, and maybe that's just my lack of historical knowledge.
Look, if you simplified it, you would be demonstrating a lack of historical knowledge. It is complex.
Yeah.
But complex doesn't necessarily mean
pointless.
wrong
Yeah.
or pointless.
Yeah.
Nor does the huge death count mean that it was conducted stupidly.
Right.
I mean, one of our popular myths in Australia is, the British butcher generals, and if only we'd been in charge, we'd have been in Berlin,
Yeah.
in 6 weeks, which you can actually find those kinds of statements in some soldier diaries.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is, the First World War was being fought in a completely new way, and the generals had to learn. They were on a learning curve. They rarely made the same mistake twice.
Yeah, so right, trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, tanks, like mustard
planes,
gas.
you name it, gas.
Yeah, all
and
new
the thing
technology.
is that the guys on the other side are learning at the same rate as you are. So you go, aha, that didn't work, I'll try this. And they're going, oh boy, that nearly worked, let me do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so you find both sides going through a learning curve simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes them, there are some fundamental military mechanics as to why the First World War on the Western Front was a stalemate.
Yeah.
And it's easy to blame stupid generals, and that's not fair.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you mentioned this. There was this tension there, these national egos. I wonder, when you look around the world right now, you see, for example, in the Middle East, we seem to have, the US, Saudi Arabia, and the Sunni militants kind of lining up against, Russia and Iran and Syria and some of the Shia sort of forces. In Libya, just recently, it seems like this sort of pattern is repeating itself again, as it did in Syria, as it sort of has in Iraq. Do you see a risk of forgetting some of those lessons from the First World War, those national ego sort of lessons, and perhaps repeating some of those same disasters?
We've never learnt those lessons.
Yeah.
You haven't mentioned China or North Korea.
Well, yeah, there's that too. Yeah.
Not to single them out, but to add them to the pool of collective egos that are clashing in the world.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And Australia is innocent only because our military muscle is smaller than our political desire.
Yeah.
It's a human problem. We've been violent with each other since the dawn of human history.
Yeah.
It's not war we need to change. It's human nature.
Boy, yeah, that's a challenge. Have you seen any suggestions of that being possible? I mean, I know there are advocates out there who say that there are peacemaking efforts that have actually been more successful in achieving political goals, in achieving harmony between parties in conflict than actual war. Do you see potential there for peacemaking strategies being taken more seriously?
Oh, absolutely. There's a famous statement by Jesus in the Bible, blessed are the peacemakers. And there is something special about peace. If you want to look, for example, at World War I and World War II, you can't make peace by waging war.
Yeah.
You can't kill people into goodness.
Yeah.
I read the diary of an Australian soldier. He was Christian and very committed. And he heard a chaplain say, I've come over here to beat the offending Adam out of the Germans. And he wrote, I don't want to go into war with a bitter spirit, with an angry spirit. And I like this idea of beating the offending Adam out of the Germans. Well, he was killed in his first battle. It was the Battle of Fromelles.
Oh, okay.
His body was recently recovered. It's in the Pheasant Wood Cemetery at Fromelles. On the other side in that battle was a certain corporal, a German corporal, Austrian actually. His name was Adolf Hitler.
Whoa.
He survived that battle and many others. And he's living proof that you cannot beat the offending Adam out of somebody with guns and bullets. He started the Second World War out of vengeance for the First. What's the difference between the First and the Second World War is in the First World War, the winners sought to punish the losers.
Yeah.
And in the Second World War, the Americans, bless their souls, decided to win over as many of their enemies as possible by generously rebuilding them, Japan and Germany.
Well, after dropping nuclear bombs on them, it needs to be added. But yes, I see what you're saying.
You can't wage war nicely.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is you can win a war through military means, but you have to win a peace afterwards.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're up for another war.
Well, you're right, yeah.
And what we're good at doing as humans is fighting wars and winning them. But we're not good at going, now that I've won it, I have to treat my enemy as my friend. Otherwise, they will continue to be my enemy.
Yeah, and I guess we've seen this in Iraq, we've seen this in Afghanistan. Yes, it's easy to, topple a dictator or kick out the Taliban or whatever, but yeah, winning the peace is the challenge, yeah.
And it's often more expensive than the war, and that's why we won't do it.
Yeah, sure.
We're too selfish and greedy.
Sure. Now, look, Daniel Kuberik in his article goes through a number of ways to, his article is called How to Remember Them, and he gives a number of practical ways about, educating yourself. There are online resources, there are Remembrance Day services, happening all over the place. In New Zealand, they have a national grave cleaning project, which sounds great. And there are also a bunch of veterans organisations you can donate to and help out and support. What would you suggest, Daniel, or what has been the most meaningful to you when it comes to Remembrance Day, when it comes to doing something practical or something with your family that increases your knowledge or appreciation, or perhaps makes a positive contribution in remembrance?
Personally, I'm a big fan of turning Lest We Forget into a contemporary action rather than a retrospective one.
Mm-hmm. Oh, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'm not opposed to clean graves and tidy war cemeteries or, dawn parades or any other form of commemoration. But if these people genuinely fought for our freedom, then to honour them would be to advance the cause of freedom here and now for people who have less freedom than we do. There are plenty of them in Australian society, and there are plenty more in the rest of the world. So maybe the best commemoration we could do is to take their death seriously by making someone's life better. Yeah,
wow. Hey, thank you so much for your time today, Professor Daniel Renaud. I really appreciate your insights.
A pleasure.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.